As most of you know, we've been working our way through the first letter of the Apostle Peter in our morning services, and 2 weeks ago, Peter started speaking very plainly about the topic of suffering. This is something that he had mentioned in passing a couple of times through the letter, something that he's alluded to at a few points, but he moves into this section now where he speaks about it at length and very plainly. A couple of weeks ago, Peter talked about, and so we talked about, how suffering brought forgiveness through Jesus Christ and how suffering brings sanctification for us, that it's one of the way that the Lord uses to make us more like Him. We talked about how suffering isn't always only a negative thing, but the Lord can use it for our ultimate good. And this morning, in our passage today, closing out chapter 4, Peter's going to continue this line of teaching. Only he's going to sort of expand on what he said two sections prior. He's going to go a little bit further, and he's going to tell us how we ought to respond to suffering that we find in our lives. Particularly how we ought to respond to any suffering that may come our way for being Christians. Suffering that may find us simply because we name the name of Jesus and simply because we follow Him. So suffering that comes to us for that reason. How do we think about it? And how do we react to it? That's what Peter writes about this morning. So I'm gonna ask you to open up your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 12 through 19. 1 Peter 4, 12 to 19. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, this is hard for us, to entrust our souls to You, even when things happen to us that we would rather not. Especially things that are hard that would be easy to avoid simply by disavowing or disobeying You. So we pray, Holy Spirit, shape the way that we think about these things and how we respond to them through Your word given to us through Peter. Help him to teach us, to prepare us for whatever opposition may come our way in whatever form it might take. for naming the name of Jesus. Make our hearts and our minds ready to hear it, to be willing to accept it, even if we don't particularly like it. Help us to learn to entrust our souls to you, our faithful Creator. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. A few things that Peter says in this passage. The first one, don't be surprised by suffering for Christ. That's the first one. And it's pretty well exactly what he says in verse 12. Don't be surprised by suffering for Christ. Let's read again verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Here's the hard truth. Suffering for the sake of Jesus shouldn't come as a surprise to Christians. Now, this doesn't mean that Christians are in that each and every individual Christian is in a perpetual state of being persecuted for their faith, but it does mean that some measure of suffering for the sake of naming Christ is a real and predictable possibility for any Christian at any time, no matter where you live. Now let's talk about this for a second, because we have, and I think especially in sort of the Western world, where Christianity has enjoyed a privileged place in society for much of the last several centuries anyway, and where that privilege is beginning to wane, and where we have not experienced much in the way of religious persecution for many centuries. In the Western world anyway, for the last number of centuries, any religious persecution is, generally speaking, for Christians anyway, is generally speaking coming from other Christians. We're good at taking our beefs with each other, our internecine struggles, our arguments within the Christian faith, and putting it on each other. And we've even fought wars over it in Europe several hundred years ago. But anyway, for much of that time, we Christians in the Western world haven't endured very much in the way of persecution, and yet we know that these teachings are there in the New Testament. And so we have a way of thinking about persecution. We have a way of romanticizing it because we haven't endured all that much or any of it ourselves, like it's something that ought to be sought out by us. That if any opportunity for anything that might resemble persecution comes along, we ought to run headlong into it. Or anything negative that comes our way should be called persecution because Peter says things like this, and so it might prove the reality of our faith if we can show the different ways that we're being persecuted, whether it amounts to persecution or not. But I want us to see that this passage isn't telling us that we ought to seek out our own suffering for the sake of Jesus. Now we're gonna go on and talk about what it is saying, but let's first start by saying what it's not saying. It doesn't mean that you seek out your own suffering for the sake of Christ. Peter says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." The language that Peter uses is of something that happens suddenly or unexpectedly, something that at a moment comes upon you, not something that you have orchestrated to make happen or that you've sought out intentionally. He's talking about suffering that comes upon you to test you. That is suffering that the Lord brings to a person for their ultimate good. Something that comes upon you, not that you orchestrate for yourself. To illustrate this point, let me talk, and I'm going to ask you to indulge me. Let me talk just for a few minutes about a little bit of church history. In the 2nd century, in the 150s, we're about 110, 120 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. In the 100s AD, there was a Christian bishop in Asia Minor, today what we call Turkey, who had come to be known as Polycarp. It was a nickname, sort of, that had been given to him by people. In Greek, it meant much fruit. And what a wonderful reputation for a Christian to have, that the people who were around him, who knew him fairly well, thought that he ought to be called much fruit, that he was so known by, known for things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and self-control and all of those good things. So anyway, the Christians at the time in the Roman Empire were undergoing a certain amount of persecution. It wasn't the persecution at its height, but it had started. The Roman government, at the time anyway, the Roman government didn't seek Christians out to persecute them. They weren't going house to house and asking everybody if they were Christians to drag them out and beat them or whatever. But if an accusation was brought against someone that they were a Christian, that person was required to renounce Christ and offer a sacrifice to the emperor if they had been accused. And if they wouldn't do that, then there were really serious things that would happen. There'd be loss of property, there could be beatings, there could be imprisonment, and there could be death. This had been the policy ever since Emperor Trajan in the Roman Empire. And so many Christians were being accused in the city of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, in Asia Minor. And there was a public outcry for the local bishop, Polycarp, to be arrested. So Polycarp, when he first heard the news that they were looking for him, that they were trying to arrest him, at first, when he heard about this, he hid for a few days. But then, a few days in, he decided that his arrest was God's will, that he could keep running and hiding, but eventually they were going to find him. And so he just decided to give himself up. And so when the accusations were made against him that he was a Christian, when he was required to renounce Christ and offer a sacrifice to the emperor, when urged to curse Christ by saying, "Out with the atheists," which is what the Romans called Christians, because they didn't have any physical gods. They didn't have any statues that they burned incense to or that they prayed to. And so since they didn't have any physical gods, they must believe that there are no gods. That was how the reasoning went. So Polycarp was told to curse Christ by saying, "Out with the atheists." And Polycarp, feeling a little bit feisty that day, pointed to the gathered Romans around him and said, "Yes, out with the atheists." He refused to recant, saying, "How could I curse my king who saved me?" And then he was burned at the stake. Polycarp's experiences so early on in the Christian faith, so early on in church history, helped shape early Christian thought about martyrdom, about persecution, and about suffering. That martyrdom wasn't something that one chose, but something that one was chosen by God for. Those who ran forward offering themselves as martyrs in the early centuries of the church were considered false martyrs by the other Christians because God hadn't chosen them for this suffering. They had tried to orchestrate it for themselves. Provoking opposition was seen as trying to manufacture that which should come upon you. Yet those to whom martyrdom came by no work of their own, without seeking it, were believed to be true martyrs, that they had followed in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And so I think Peter and Polycarp give us important ways to think about suffering for the sake of Christ. We don't seek it out. We don't provoke to try to make it happen, but there will come times in life when experiencing loss for the sake of believing in Jesus and following him comes upon us. So what then? What then? That's going to be our second point. You are blessed to suffer for Christ. You are blessed to suffer for Christ. Look at verses 13 and 14. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Peter says that when the Lord sees fit to have us endure suffering for the sake of naming Jesus, we should rejoice insofar as we share in the sufferings of Jesus. That doesn't mean, he says to rejoice and he says to be glad when these things come upon us as we go through this passage. That doesn't mean that when we experience some sort of loss because we believe in Jesus, that doesn't mean that it's fun, or that doesn't mean that we always have to have a smile on our face or that we enjoy it. Rather, Peter is saying, give thanks to God and give glory to God when these things happen to you, because what's happening is that God is providing a path for you where you get to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. That just as your Lord suffered, your heavenly Father sees fit to have you in some small way follow in his footsteps after him. Now think about this. We don't like suffering, right? No one does. And our cultural moral narrative is that pleasure is always a worthy pursuit and pain is always pointless and evil. So pain is to be avoided at all costs. If there's any way to avoid it, take it. But this isn't so. That's not right. There are worse things than pain. There are worse things than loss. There are worse things than rejection. And there are worse things than death. When threatened with being burned alive, Polycarp responded that earthly fire was for but a moment, but eternal fire would never go out. But Peter goes even further than this and tells us that there is blessing in suffering for Jesus. That we should consider it an honor when our Heavenly Father gives us a path that follows in the footsteps of Jesus. Jesus talks about this in John chapter 15. You can turn there if you like, but I'm going to read from there. John 15, I'm going to read verses 18 through 20. This is Jesus speaking. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. Jesus says that it's not surprising when things like this happen to us because they happen to him. And if Jesus, who is perfect and has no sin and always speaks the truth and acts with love in every possible way, embodies truth and justice and righteousness, if he is rejected and despised, if he suffers, then why should we expect better than him? More than that, Peter says if we are insulted for Christ, if you're insulted for Christ, then you are blessed because the Spirit of Christ rests upon you. There is a promise for a particular and special presence and blessing of the Holy Spirit when you are maligned for Jesus' sake. Maybe that simply means he provides the patience and the steadfastness to endure it. Peter doesn't elaborate, but he makes it clear that when the world pulls away from you and puts you down for Jesus' sake, the Lord draws near to you. So all of this should recast the way we consider what's happening to us when people give us a hard time because we're Christians. Some people experience very little of this in their lives. That's okay. It's not a thing to be ashamed of. There are other places in the world, on the other hand, where it is commonplace for Christians to lose jobs or homes or to be imprisoned or even to die for the sake of Jesus. For us, it's less severe, but it's still hard to know how to respond to it, because we are so hardwired to avoid pain at all costs, no matter what it takes. Maybe you're in university, and belief in things like the virgin birth or the bodily resurrection of Jesus are ridiculed since miracles do not happen. We know that they don't happen. So how can you believe some things that are so silly, so antiquated? Or maybe your circle of friends thinks you promote hatred because of Christian doctrine about sexuality and humanity being made male and female. Or maybe the place you work is engaging in shady and dishonest business practices that you can't engage in conscientiously, so your job is in jeopardy. It would be very easy to rationalize denying a basic truths about the faith, or changing your views simply to avoid hard conversations, or going along for the sake of convenience and ease. After all, we tell ourselves, God would never want me to go through hard things because of my faith. But that simply isn't true. What if we viewed these things instead as opportunities to grow in faithfulness? What if we saw them as the Lord honoring us by having us walk in the footsteps of Jesus? What if we knew that even though others would pull away from us, the Holy Spirit would draw near to us and be upon us in a special way? Would that change the way that we approach these situations? Would it change what we want so that avoiding difficulty isn't the primary goal in every hard thing that comes our way? As Peter says in verse 19, "Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." And the last thing, suffering is a part of our salvation. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by that. But first, let's read verses 15 through 18. "But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner?" So I said that suffering is a part of our salvation. Let me be clear what I do not mean when I say that. I do not mean that we are justified by our suffering. Justification is God declaring us righteous. We can only ever be righteous when we are covered by the perfect righteousness of Jesus. And we only receive his righteousness by faith in him. We only become acceptable to God by faith in Jesus. Our sins are put on him, his righteousness is given to us, and we are just in God's sight. We often use the word saved or salvation to refer to justification, like they're the same thing. We might say, I got saved when I was 15, if that's the age when we came to faith. And that's an okay way to use the word, but the Bible uses the word salvation much more broadly than that. The Bible very often uses the word salvation to refer to all the blessings and all the benefits of belonging to Jesus. So salvation includes your election to belong to him from eternity past, your regeneration when God takes your dead and stony heart and makes it alive and gives you the gift of faith in Jesus, your sanctification, God's continual work in you through the Holy Spirit to make you more like Jesus, and your glorification when you are raised at the last day to a new resurrection body. You are stripped of all sin and all of the effects of sin, and we enjoy eternal life in resurrection bodies without sin or grief or pain or death. All of these things fall into the sort of broad umbrella of what the Bible calls salvation. And Peter says that the righteous are scarcely saved. That sounds like he's saying that the people who end up in heaven just barely get there. But the Greek word translated scarcely carries with it the idea of something happening with great difficulty. It's not that we barely end up in heaven, but that as a part of our salvation, God makes us more like him. He grows us in family resemblance to our elder brother Jesus. He works holiness inside of us to become more like him. And that one of the very best ways that we grow up in our faith, that we grow in holiness, is through suffering. God grows and matures us in the faith through difficulty. Now, Peter says, don't think just because you're going through a hard time that you are suffering for the sake of Christ. If you suffer because you murder someone, or you steal from someone, or you're a meddler, I love that he uses that term. If you're putting yourself in the midst of everybody else's business, you are bound to end up suffering for those things. Peter says, don't think of yourself as suffering for Christ when those things happen, okay? If you suffer for as a consequence of your own well-doing, that's not persecution for Jesus. But when these things do come upon you, when you do suffer loss simply for believing in and following Jesus, God is using that for your good. It is a part of your salvation. It is you becoming more like Jesus through God's work in you, walking the path that he's given you to walk. And so Peter presents us with our starkest choices. There is no escaping suffering. It will come to us one way or another. Peter says, if the Lord chastens those whom he loves and disciplines them, if this is how the Lord treats his children, then what will befall those who do not love or obey him? So essentially, Peter is saying, so you can embrace that suffering for Christ is not something to be avoided at all costs, but rather a blessing for the Christian, and you can suffer now, should it come upon you, as an act of God's grace to you in learning to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Or you can avoid suffering now so much as it depends on you. You can renounce Jesus and find as much ease as you can get your hands on in this life. But what will become of the ungodly and the sinner, Peter says. When suffering for Christ's sake comes upon you, rejoice and be glad, for God is revealing his glory in you. Let's pray. Father, we do not like pain. We do not like to suffer. We don't even like to be uncomfortable. And so help us to remember that our comfort is not our greatest good. And our ease is not your will for our lives. And so when suffering comes, when loss comes, simply for believing in Jesus, not because of some provocation of ours, not because of some wrongdoing on our part, not because of some meddling we have gotten ourselves into, but simply when it comes for believing in and following Jesus. Help us not to run away from it, to do whatever we can to stop it from happening. But help us to rejoice and be glad, to be content, to follow in the footsteps of our Lord, and to entrust our souls to you, knowing that you will use it for your glory, for our good, that you might use such difficulty in our salvation, making us more like our elder brother Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.